Workplaces. Dun, dun, dun. I hope that's not the case for you, but maybe that is. And maybe you can turn up your radio to find out some tips from Bobby Albert. Hi, Bobby. How are you?
All right. Good morning.
So you're checking in from Wichita Falls, Texas. Thanks for being on this morning. When it comes to a toxic workplace, let's share some examples of what you might find in your work.
Well, one thing that has been very interesting is Gallup has done a tremendous survey. They surveyed over 1 million employees at over 85,000 companies. And one of the things they found was that companies choose the wrong person for the management job about 82% of the time.
What?
Which is pretty amazing. Yeah, 82% of the time. And what happens when an organization puts somebody in a position, or most often it happens because maybe they were the best salesperson in the organization and they reward them for that position, but they never did prepare them for that, and that person really doesn't know how to manage well, and they end up being a bad boss. And when the leader ends up being not performing very well, sometimes they create a toxic culture, which is it's very damaging to the organization. Let me just give you one other thing, or two other things on the Gallup survey. They found that people working for bad bosses, that there was a 50% less productivity in the organization, and they were 44% less profits.
Whoa, not good. Now, as you mentioned, some people might be rewarded for their good work and bumped up to a leadership position, but sometimes they're just not qualified. How can you solve that then? Should you send folks off to a seminar or something?
Well, that would be helpful, but what they've got to do is, prior to even offering a position to somebody like that, is take them through a normal interview process, just like they would if they were, just like they came off the street and they were a new employee, a potential employee.
I see. So just, interview them as you would anything else, because it's such a big position and a leadership role in your company. I'm kind of taken aback by that 82%. I'm sorry. I lost my words.
Well, it's and let me just suggest this for your audience here is, if they are an employee working for a bad boss, and they may be a good person, but they're just a bad boss. Mm-hmm. But some bad bosses, like I mentioned, it creates this toxic culture. And your intuition is going to tell you things are not going well here. So let me suggest this, is the first thing a person ought to do is to make their current job the best they can have. If they are not able to do that, and I would suggest that, we live in this improved economy, and there's a lot of job opportunities, is to look out for another job. But let me give you a few warnings for some people. Number one, I wouldn't choose a job just because I'm making a little bit more money. Number two is that if you don't investigate the other job opportunity well, about what does that company stand for? Will they even care for me? Will they even help me learn how to do my job, to the best I can? Will they even allow me to contribute to the goals of the organization with my thoughts? If they don't do that, sometimes people jump jobs and then they end up in a worse condition than they came from. Mm-hmm. So someone looking around is not to pick something right away. Keep your options open for yourself and choose the best job that fits you not just because they pay more.
Right. Workplace culture specialist Bobby Albert on the air with us at ESPN 93.5 at 8:40. I also had heard start journaling some of your concerns so that you have some dates and times and you can, trigger some recollection if it does get pretty bad.
Well, of course. And there's sometimes, if it's a larger organization, is to talk to the human resource department about your work conditions and see if they can have an influence on improving it. If they can't, it's probably sometimes good that you, like you just said, is to keep some notes because if you are terminated because you're working for this bad boss, is for not really very good reasons, you need to be able to capture what's going on.
Right. Actually, Bobby, a little insight on me. Back in the 90s when I just got into radio, I had a few different stations that I worked for where, they'd have like the Bud Girls or whatever the alcoholic beverage was, where they'd have the scantily clad women and, different calendars and promotional materials and events where that would be a part of it, wet t-shirt contest, whatever. And when I was visiting with my sister in Seattle, her neighbor was doing this sexual harassment video, and they asked me to talk about all that and if I was intimidated by that atmosphere. And I'm on this video that a lot of people have to watch and say that they, understood what sexual harassment was and that they shouldn't bring these type of calendars or whatever in the workplace. So it's kind of funny. I have this background of being part of that video and that people oftentimes have to watch. I've been approached 3 times saying, were you in this video? I guess it was nationally produced. But in that kind of atmosphere where the boss is kind of, good old boy style or whatever, wink, wink, nudge, nudge all the time. I mean, I've always fought back with that sort of similar behavior to, give you what you're shooting at me. But maybe it's my, construction as a teenager background that makes me want to just fire it right back at them. What's your thoughts on some of that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up what you just did because just a few weeks ago, a very well-known company, the CEO was asked to resign, and the name of that company is Uber. And it's because of starting with a leader that had developed an extremely toxic culture in the organization, and they, of course, themselves are incurring sex harassment lawsuits. They've been things like stolen technology because there's a lawsuit between them and the parent company of Google, Alphabet. There's federal probing and investigation going on because of them using technology to evade some of the regulations. There's a board member that was recently asked to resign because of the sexist comment he made. This is another matter is one of the key executives obtained some medical records of a woman that was raped that was employed there. And they have lost, prior to this CEO asking to resign, they had lost their chief operating officer, their chief financial officer, their general counsel, their chief marketing officer, and several other good employees that could not operate in that type of environment. So that's what happens when, like you said, wink, wink, let's have some fun kind of a thing. It just doesn't work.
Yep. Keep it out of the office. It's fine for your man cave, but let's all get something done and make some money. All right. Well, thanks for being on and giving us some suggestions when it comes to a toxic work environment of how we can kind of be a part of solving the problem and turning things around.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Take care. Bobby Albert, workplace culture specialist.
Hey, listen to this. According to a Gallup report, companies choose the wrong person for management jobs 82% of the time. And that can lead to a toxic workplace.
Ouch.
82% of the time, they pick a wrong manager.
So what's going wrong here? Kogo News Liveline, we have workplace culture specialist Bobby Albert. And Bobby, why are they hiring the wrong people? What's going on here?
Well, Gallup has really done some wonderful research, because through that research, they have surveyed over 1 million employees and over 85,000 companies. So this is a huge sampling. And one of the things they have found is that these bad bosses, that through Gallup survey, they found that when people are working for these type of bosses that shouldn't have never been hired there to begin with, there's a 50% less productivity, and there's a 44% less in profits. And what happens often is somebody is rewarded into a leadership position because maybe they were the best salesperson in the organization, or they were the best at this or that, and they really weren't prepared to even take that position. It doesn't mean there were maybe bad people. They just never were prepared for that position. But if I might bring up just an example, what can happen to a culture when you are working in a toxic environment, and it's driven by the CEO that's a bad boss. Just look at a few weeks ago, the CEO of Uber was asked to resign. Now, just let me give you kind of a quick rundown of a toxic environment that some people may be working in. Well, one is that last year, in 2016, they lost $2.8 billion. The first quarter of 2017, they lost $708 million. They not only have lost their CEO, who was a founder and driving this type of culture, but recently they've also lost their chief operating officer, their chief financial officer, their general counsel, their chief marketing officer. Now they're being run by a committee of 4 people, which is terrible. That's like trying to herd cats, of 12,000 employees. There have been recent acquisitions of sexism, sex harassment. There's a lawsuit through Google, their parent company Alphabet, because of stolen tech.
I'm sorry, Bobby. I got to interrupt you because we're running out of time, and I got to ask, what do you do if somebody's listening and they have a toxic boss, and this happens all the time? What's the best way to handle it?
Well, one of the best things is try to make where you're working at the best that you can do right where you are. If you can't seem to work with that, I tell you what, we live in an economy right now where the jobs are plentiful out there. So there's no harm in looking at other businesses to see if there's opportunity there. And that's what I would suggest doing.
So just, how do you know when it is time to quit? When you know, okay, this person is never going to change, HR is never going to deal with it, and the big boss is never going to deal with it.
Well, you really touched on it, is when you have done everything you can and you know that this bad boss is not going to change, they're going to continue being the bad boss, and that you are in a toxic environment, and it goes against your core values and what you even stand for, it's time for you to move on.
All right, Bobby, we will leave it at that. Thank you for your advice. Workplace culture specialist Bobby Albert joining us on the Kogo News Live line.
The signs that your boss or your workplace is toxic. Now, the old line from the Supreme Court, the late Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, I think, applies. He wasn't talking about this. He was talking about, obscenity and pornography. And they said, what's the definition? He goes, I can't define it, but you know what? I know it when I see it. The signs your boss or workplace is toxic. People who are driving right now are saying you just have to take one look around and Can you ever know going in the door And once you're in the midst of it, how do you extract yourself from working for, basically Mr. or Mrs. Satan? Let's talk about it this morning with Bobby Albert, workplace culture specialist, back in the show again. Bobby, good morning.
Good morning.
The Devil, what was the movie The Devil Wears Prada? That was Meryl Streep. Horrible Bosses, wanted to Kevin Spacey. So these are kind of the poster children out there, but you don't need to go to a movie to see bad bosses. A lot of folks, unfortunately, they just have to walk in the door where they work.
Well, exactly right. There's many people that are working for bad bosses, and they're working in a toxic environment. Gallup has surveyed over 85,000 companies and over 1 million employees, and through their survey, they have found that companies choose the wrong person for a management job 82% of the time. So what happens, what kind of condition do you see happening in a culture when you're working for a bad boss or a bad leader is that what Gallup found is that there's a 50% less in productivity and there's a 44% less in profits to the organization. And, like you brought up, well, what do you do if you're in that environment?
Right.
And there are ways to prevent going in there if you just are very check out the companies and things like that. But granted, I realize we've come out of a very difficult economy, and some people took a job thinking, I need the income.
Right.
But if you find that you're there and things are not working well, first thing is try to do the best job you can where you are. But there's no harm in looking somewhere else. When you have, it's a kind of an intuition, you kind of touched on it, is that if you sense that it's time for me to go and you're looking somewhere else and you find the right job for you, then go ahead and take it. But there's a word of caution, is what I have seen often in a lot of different situations is that people take another job a little bit too quickly. They didn't check them out enough, and they end up in a worse situation than they came out of. So, or it wasn't as, everything is so rosy and things that looks on the, on the outside, but when they get inside the organization, it's another terrible and toxic culture.
Well, I want to explore that for a second. You make a great point there. Let's take it another step. If you're somewhere right now where maybe you're not making top dollar, you're not maybe getting rich, but somehow every day you get excited when you get out of bed and you don't feel like just staying another 20 minutes under the covers. You're energized. You like the people you're around. Your boss treats you well. Respects what you say, respects what you do, wants to try to advance you, all these things. It may not be perfect in terms of money, but that's where the danger can be. You may have somebody else, Bobby, who's recruiting you, but if you really like the people you're working with and think you've got a good fit for at least a while, you might want to then say, I shouldn't just assume the grass is greener, because making a few more bucks for a lousy work experience is never a good trade-off.
Well, you're exactly right, and a lot of people, I would say a lot of people make that mistake. They go for the money without really thinking about what's the culture they're going into. What is the leadership style there? Is it a fit for me as to who I am? What does that company stand for? Will they help me in training and,
right,
and leading? And, all of it, will they even care for me once I get there? So you really touched on it there, that I wouldn't jump just because there's a little bit more money, unless it's very significant. Then you got to kind of weigh some of those things out. But if you've got a good job, and this is one of the employers, one of the challenges of this brave new workplace that we live in, particularly with an improving economy.
What's the worst boss manager you've ever encountered? I'm talking like, a combination of the Meryl Streep Kevin Spacey, where somebody was just borderline, driven, but also psychotic and willing to throw anybody under the bus. I know you've met, you've either worked for somebody like that or you tried to coach them, and you were just like, what do we have here, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah. Well, I've seen plenty, and but there is an example that's been in the news. It's been a few weeks ago, but recently the CEO of Uber was asked to resign. And even though I don't know that CEO personally, but everything I've read and studied, because I'm interested in what's going on, man, I tell you what, that's a toxic environment, and there's all kinds. I mean, they have lawsuits that are going on. I mean, very significant things. You know, executives that have left the company because they couldn't, work in that type of environment. It's that organization, and they're losing a lot of money. I realize they're a startup, but
they've gone beyond that stuff. I get where you're going with it, but they're beyond that now, and they have. Look, if you work with CEOs too, if you're the CEO and you're considered with horns on your head like this, that kind of atmosphere, you're going to embolden people to act like you down below, and other people are going to run. And at some point, like you said, you start hemorrhaging. That can't last. That's untenable for a corporation in the United States of America these days.
Yeah, well, the sad thing is when you work in a toxic environment, the best employees end up leaving.
Sure.
So what's left? It's the people that will tolerate, or they even like this toxic environment, but the profits are going down, productivity's just going haywire, and eventually the company will collapse.
Yeah, and then the press gets out, and the media is rough. The social media is brutal, and you're asked by the folks at the public meeting to depart immediately. By the way, here's security. It's just not a pretty picture. But that's what it's like for some people out there. Don't work. If you know your box is toxic, if you're convinced it's not you, you look around and you see others, and the morale is dropping. You've got to give it a real careful consideration. Bobby, where do we find you online?
Well, thank you for asking. It's simply BobbyAlbert.com, and I do have a new book that'll be coming out next month.
Got the new book. Got a title for it?
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's Principal Profits, and the subtitle is Outward Success is an Inside Job.
I like it. I can't believe I had to prompt you for it, but I like it. But holy smoke, that's a first. That happened with a politician this week, too. The whole world's turned upside down. I don't get it. Bobby, always appreciate having you come on. Have a great morning.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
There it is, 1320 Morning Wake Up.